When you talk about Lou Scheimer, you're talking about somebody who was really the quintessential self-made American success story.
He's one of the nicest human beings to walk the earth, and his smile was medicating to a lot of people.
He liked the idea of being kind of a trailblazer, of bringing things in when he didn't have to. He was the one who brought in the first black character in Saturday morning animation, which I appreciated being a kid watching it at the time.
Filmation, to be the success that it was for as long as it was, and to have as many innovations as it has, really needed a strong leader. And Lou was that leader.
It was the only place where you actually felt like you belonged.
Everybody came through Filmation, and my dad thrived on that. He loved the talent.
Lou was real good at recognizing people's abilities and not afraid to take a chance on somebody.
When Filmation closed, the largest employer of American animators closed, and that was a huge blow to the industry.
It was a passing of an era, you know. It felt like there goes something that we had a great time with, and it's sad to see it leave.
My dad grew up in Pittsburgh, and both of his parents were immigrants. His father was German and his mother was Russian, and the only common language they spoke was Yiddish.
My economic background was nil. It was the middle of the Depression, the very beginning of the Depression, 1932. My father was out of work, and he borrowed from his brother a humongous amount of money. It was $200, and bought this little store. And we moved into a neighborhood where there were no Jews.
And that was a big deal back in my dad's day, who was Jewish, who was Catholic, and who wasn't. And, but he got along with everybody, and I think that sort of set the tone for his life.
My father and mother both pushed me toward what I wanted to do. And I was lucky in that respect.
My dad lost his father when he was only 14 years old, and they lived above this little grocery store. And his mother would sell things through the course of the day.
She could speak English, but she couldn't write English. And everybody who bought stuff from us were buying it on the cuff, as it was, because they could only pay every Tuesday.
When my dad would come home from school at the end of the day, he would go through and write up the orders and be able to add and tally and figure out what was sold for the day.
We lived there for, I was there until I was 17. And when I was 17, I knew I had to join the Army because it's the only way I could get enough money to go to art school. I could have gotten a scholarship to University of Pittsburgh, but I didn't want to do that because I'd be another Jewish lawyer, and I didn't think that was very good for me or for Judaism or for the world. I was probably the worst soldier ever in the Army. The war would have been lost if I had not come in that late. I realized then I was not the right person to be born and to be bred to join the Army. And the Army realized it too.
He was deployed over in the Pacific, and that's actually where he had his first professionally published artwork done.
Stars and Stripes was the GI paper. And in the newspaper, they had a comic strip. I said, I gotta get to that paper.
He didn't know what the heck he was doing. He didn't know how to do any of those things, but he said he just walked in there and just asked, and they gave him a job.
Following his days in the military, Lou went back to Pittsburgh and enrolled at Carnegie Tech, where he pursued his art career.
Carnegie Tech's attitude was, it wasn't what you did physically with the stuff, it's how you approached the thing.
Yes, he learned techniques of painting, but he really learned to problem solve. One of the greatest things that he took away from his whole education was the ability to problem solve. And I remember sitting with him at Filmation and him saying, hey, see, this is what I was learning back in Carnegie.
While he was at Carnegie Tech, Lou met the woman who would become the one major force in his life, who's always been there, which is his wife, Jay.
I met her at a party. She was gorgeous, and I was 21 years old, had never had a real girlfriend, had never seen anything quite as beautiful as that, and I was drawn to her. I ended up marrying her, which is the best thing that ever happened to me. I'm not too sure for her sake whether it was or not. And life changed after that.
I think my mother was convinced of his genius a lot more than my dad was. And she visioned that she met him, they were gonna go live in the West Bank, and he was gonna be an artist, and they were gonna live in a cold water flat, and it was gonna be wonderful. And my dad just wanted to get a job, and he had no delusions about that.
We had to meet someplace in the middle. And I'd always been interested in animation. UPA had just started in business a couple years before that, and they were doing these wonderful, creative-looking things that were so different from whatever else was being done for the mass market. And I said, gee, I'd love to work at a place like that.
They moved from Pittsburgh to California eventually, with Lou actually pursuing an interest in animation.
I got to Los Angeles, and I went to the place that was going to hire me. He said, oh, sorry, fella. We hired somebody last week. I damn near convulsed. I went to a bunch of studios to see whether there was any work at all. And I had this, what I thought was a wonderful portfolio. I went down to Walter Lance's studio. I asked him if there was any work I could pick up freelance. And I asked him, I said, Mr. Lance, I said, did you really like my portfolio? Your portfolio? He said, I like you because you look like my brother Michael. I said, I spent 4 years at Carnegie Tech, and I get a job by looking like somebody's brother. I said, I might have wasted 4 years. I didn't know. I truly believed I had the ability to do what had to be done. And it was a difficult thing to do because the world was not the kind of place that cared. I started working for Larry Harmon doing Bozo the Clown. I laid out about 100 of those things. Hal came to work there just a little after I came to work there.
I was working at Disney's. One of the employees from Disney's who had been laid off and had since gone to work for Larry Harmon Productions, he says, they need a key assistant animator over here. He says, if you'd like the job, I recommended you. And I said, well, things don't look too good here. Let me come on down and talk to you. So I went down to their studio, and I went in, and they were in a small office, and here was Lou in the middle of this one small room, and he was in direct center, and everybody else had desks all the way around him, and he was in there painting backgrounds. And I always thought that was the humorous part of that meeting.
Hal and I met each other, and we liked each other, and we had a hell of a time. Fun, I mean, putting things together and getting the layouts done, and we realized that the two of us, plus some outside help, could do a picture if we wanted to.
We liked working with each other, and we talked over things. What do you think is going to happen here? How are we going to make out? I was eventually let go from there as things started to go downhill on Bozo the Clown and what we were working on, and I went to work for an outfit called True Line. When Lou finally was cut loose from Larry Harmon Productions, I helped get him on there. I suggested he came on, and they welcomed him with open arms, and so his desk sat right beside mine, and so we were able to talk about maybe we could do this, maybe we could do that.
Going into business for ourselves that was simple. I wanted to know when I was going to get fired. We find out that it's an industry that has 6 weeks worth of guarantees, and it was a terrible time in the animation industry because there was no place to go. So I said to Hal, I said, I've got 10 religious films to do on the life of Christ. Between us, we can do the whole thing. I had a relationship with a guy at Paramount that I had done some outside work for, and he wanted somebody around who could do animated material that was appropriate for them, and I got them to give us a room to work in down at Paramount.
We formed Filmation at that time. It was not prominent because we were working for somebody else, but we were trying with this word Filmation as our, you ought to do business with us.
It was called Filmation because Hal and I had to call it something. And we looked at each other and I said, why don't we call it Filmation? It is animation and it's film and it's fun to do. And he said, yep, let's do that.
We were trying for a motion picture title one time. We got my brother to come over who talks with a Boston accent, dressed him up in a pinstripe suit, and we bought a gun that when you pull the trigger, a flag comes out, and we put it in a briefcase, and we got him to go up to visit this guy at the office. The secretary announced him, and he came in, and the guy said, what can I do for you? My brother just reached into the case and pulled the gun out, and pop, But the guy almost died. This flag comes out, so if you want a bang-up title, call Filmation. So we didn't get that job, but those are the types of things. We were ready to do a lot of stuff, but we were desperate, and that brought on creativity. I've gone by that slogan for many, many years.
Some of the first jobs that Filmation did included animating commercials, car commercials where they would animate spotlights in the sky, a Ready Whip commercial which actually featured his daughter and son in it. He also met Norm Prescott, who had worked in the music industry and in the recording world.
Norm had been a very successful disc jockey in Boston. He said, well, I'm doing a picture called Journey Back to Oz, an animated film. Would you guys be interested in doing it? Yeah, I said, we can do that, and we could do it. What I did then, I had owned 80% of the business. I gave Norm half of my 80%. So I said, I don't have the money to do it. You don't have the money to do it. We got to find the money to do it. This thing falls apart. It's going to fall apart.
We had a lot to lose because it was hard paying the rent. We're in a bank building that we had rented, and we converted that into a studio, and then in the back there was a big office that could be sealed off. We set it up so that it would be a grand studio if we just had some work to do.
We took turns to answer the phone because answering the phone meant we were going to talk to somebody who we owed money to. It was Hal's turn, and Hal said, it's some guy from New York, and he says he's Mr. Superman. And I said, what? So I got on the phone. I said, are you calling from a phone booth? What the hell? Somebody calls himself Superman. He said, no. He says, I'm Superman Weisinger. I said, hello, Mr. Superman. I said, what do you want? And it's fascinating because it was not a collect call. He said, I want to talk to this guy Prescott of yours. And I said to Norm, I called him. I said, this guy's going to call you. And I gave him the number. Norman gets back to New York, calls us. He said, they're doing a series for CBS called Superman. I said, yeah. He said, they actually asked me if we wanted to do it. I said, we wanted to do it. I said, you crazy? Of course. He said, it's $36,000 for an episode. Can we do it for that? I said, of course we can do it for that. I had no idea. If there had been $10, we could have done it. We get it done. Oh, he said, by the way, they want to see the studio. I said, what studio? He said, well, that is the problem. So Hal and I started calling everybody we know. We filled that place with bodies, partially of bodies that could draw.
I had one of my brothers, and I think my wife even sat in one corner.
We had one guy from Hanna-Barbera who had to leave at 1 o'clock. We had that place filled except with one guy who couldn't make it. Thank God, because he was the guy's bookkeeper.
We figured if we walked him through very fast, he wouldn't have any time to really study what they were doing as long as they were flipping the papers.
So this guy shows up. We take the guy through the whole studio, and all these guys are all just scribbling out there, pretending they could draw. And just as he was ready to say something, there's a knock on the door, and it's George Rowley, who had to get back to Hanna-Barbera. And George reaches in, he says, hello, Hal. He says, I got this terrible toothache. He says, do you mind if I go get the dentist? I said, yeah, go ahead, George. And he closes the door, and I said to Hal, dock that son of a bitch. Norman calls me. He says, what did you guys do? He said, the guy came back and said, it's a little studio, but they run a tight ship.
My dad is one of the most honest people you will ever meet. It is an astonishing fact that he even became a success at all in this business, being honest. But I guess you have to start somewhere.
They gave us the job to do. There was the Superman series for CBS. Now that's luck. I just stumbled into things. I really, really think that I'm really one of the luckiest guys in the world. Being lucky and having the ability to utilize what you got and to do something that's appropriate with it I found my real talent.
My dad, I must say, worked from a place of fear and desperation. And there's a part of him that's a real ham, too. So I think he sort of got to wind it all together in terms of securing that job and acting the part that you needed to act.
We could do the job and do the job well, but getting the job was a job.
The story of how Lou actually got the rights to the Superman cartoon is a legend in animation. But the important thing to understand about it was that it was not only a deal to do Superman, which at that time was the most popular comic book character around, it was also a deal with a major publishing company to do cartoons based on their characters, because it led not only from Superman to Aquaman to Batman, but it also was original cartoon programming on television, and it was an early media tie-in. It kind of ushered in a whole new genre. Saturday morning hadn't been done at that point. So really, the Superman cartoon actually is very important to the history of television animation.
The Justice League of America.
I was watching Filmation cartoons since I was a kid. I was into the New Adventures of Superman in '66, Superman Aquaman in '67, and then going forward from there with the Archie Show and the Hardy Boys.
They would do Justice League cartoons. Later they did Batman. They also did a lot of funny cartoons like Mission Magic. They even did a Jerry Lewis cartoon at one point. So yeah, they were a big part of my TV diet.
Whenever Filmation came on, they treated the subject matter with some respect. For instance, when they did Superman, it was really cool because it was like the comic book. And in all the superhero stuff they did, it was very much like that. Hal Sutherland, Scheimer were sort of heroes of mine. I saw those names, and you looked at it, and you wanted to meet these people because they were doing something that I liked.
Once Filmation got the rights to do Superman, they had to create a studio from their non-existent studio.
I'd heard that they were having training classes at Filmation to get into layout. So I went over to Filmation at night. I'd leave Hanna-Barbera and I'd take the bus all the way over to Filmation out in Sherman Way and Reseda and go there at night and train. And then opportunity opened up when they sold some brand new shows the following, about 4 months later, and I left Hanna-Barbera and came to Filmation and started working there at the time.
I had been going to art school, different places, and I'd been in the Air Force as an illustrator for 4 years, and I had been working, trying to get into comics. I'd done some comics work and some science fiction book covers and stuff like that. And one of my colleagues found out about the Star Trek project, and he said, well, you want to do that? You got a portfolio full of spaceships and monsters. You gotta go over there, which I did, and I interviewed with Don Christensen and got a layout job.
My father, who had been a singer in Boston years before, had some connections to Norm Prescott, who was a disc jockey in Boston around the same time. And while they were all, renewing old ties, my dad said to Norm, well, my kid's a cartoonist and he watches everything on Saturday morning. So Norm said, well, have him show us some cartoons. Norm liked the gags. He thought it was funny. He thought the characters were kind of appealing. And he said, you have to be much more skilled than this to be an animator, but we like your writing a lot, so are you interested in taking on a couple of assignments? So I said, yeah.
I was looking for work, and I heard that they were gearing up for a real big series of some kind. So I went to Filmation, and it was kind of exciting because, once again, I had, I'd seen these names. You saw Lou's name turning on a circle on the screen. I went in and I took a layout test, a storyboard test, an animation test, and then they hired me for model design. So that kind of gives you an insight into the quirky way Filmation worked.
They promoted from within that young people out of college, as I was, would get jobs there and stay on. They would work there for a long time. They would move from one position to another. In my case, I had just graduated from college, and they found out that I didn't know what I was going to do the rest of my life. And so the camera department asked me if I would like to move into camera. And the heads of the editing department asked me if I would like to learn editing. I didn't know anything about either. And that's just an example of the sort of environment it was. It was very important to Lou particularly to have that kind of family support and provide opportunities for who came along.
At Lou's place, you were there because Lou wanted the artists there. And that's an intangible kind of thing to address, but it sort of permeated the air.
He used to love that there would be Friday night cocktail parties where the artists would hang their own individual stuff.
We were a bunch of clowns. We did a lot of funny things. We pulled pranks. We, got away with gags on people and whatnot.
Ultimately, we refer to the place as Animal House because of it was exciting to be there. And those of us who are in our 20s and early 30s just really enjoyed the working experience and the social experience.
When it came time to the work, we got our work done. We didn't miss any deadlines. We got our shows in. They looked good. And as long as we did that, Lou and Norm were happy.
It was a very celebratory atmosphere, and Lou was behind that. It has been rare since then that I've worked with anyone that has had that same kind of vision and positive attitude.
He really instilled wanted to sort of be like a school of art, even though it was a business too.
It was boot camp for me and the perfect place to go to learn the business. This is where I learned how everything was done.
You really learned everything if you stuck with it, because it was all under one roof.
You could go from the bottom of the building to the top of the building. You could meet the writers, you could meet the layout artists, you could meet designers, you could meet the painters, you could meet the guys who were doing the cells, you could see the cameras where the cells were being done, and over there you could see where they were recording the voices. Everything was done at Filmation.
It really was in the trenches TV production, and you learned very quickly what was possible and what was not.
Stock footage was an essential to everything that we did.
Stock footage was my idea. Some of the animation people we had to hire weren't that good a draftsman and that familiar with the human figure, which was prominent with the Saturday morning heroes. So we went out and we photographed the action scenes, rotoscoped it, and had the animators transfer it into the characters that we had there.
Then those same scenes were redressed with different characters as we went through different series. But we did put forth the effort in the original to get these better than average scenes that we could use over and over again, of people running and jumping and swinging.
Working from a stock footage book was one of the realities of working at Filmation. New animation is frightfully expensive to produce, and when you're given basically a shoestring budget, you have to resort to that or else you don't do a show.
You have to make compromises at some point. You have to work things out. And if you have effective stories and an effective purpose, which I think he did, then that helps to counter the lack of fullness of the animation.
We could have done it for less money overseas. The guys who sent stuff overseas ended up spending more. They were controlled by the fact that a foreign entity could charge whatever they wanted to charge after a while.
We all at Filmation were keenly aware that we were the last bastion of Saturday morning cartoons being animated in the United States. We also knew that because we were animating in the United States, that probably the overall quality was affected. We grumbled and groaned about the repeated use of stock shots and things like that and the limitations that it provided. And nevertheless, it still gave a lot of young animators more years than they otherwise would have had.
We ended up being the only company that did all of their work in this country, and that's because we had supplied ourselves with the right talent and trained people.
Again, I mean, it all makes sense for Lou, because it's people-oriented. Why would you ever send it out when you had people who wanted to do it here? And why would you ever take it away from people who you cared about?
I didn't find doing it in this country a cause célèbre. I found it as the proper thing to do, because right now you can't do a show in this country. You have no people being trained. No show that you see on television today, if it's 2D, was done in this country. I mean, the artwork, part of it was done here. The stories were done here. They recorded the characters here. The animation isn't done here anymore. The inking painting isn't done here anymore. And I think it's sad that the 2D animation is going to disappear if people don't train people to do it.
There's a lot to be said for animation that is done here. There's nothing that is better looking or feels more organic or is funnier than a short cartoon that's done by a group of people who work together.
Filmation's claim to fame in a lot of ways in the early 70s and the 80s were these pro-social messages that Lou would put on the shows.
He was very sensitive to what the audience was seeing, and he really cared about it a lot.
There was a desire to impart messages and morals to the kids, almost as a way of saying, well, you've seen a character get in trouble and this is how it applies to your life, kids. Personally, I don't think a cartoon needs to apologize to anything.
We as the artists wanted to do some more gritty stuff, some more edgy stuff, something that was less safe. And Lou just wouldn't go there.
There are millions of kids out there, and I'm talking about millions of kids. I mean, 18, 20, I have no idea. You had an obligation to do it as well as you possibly can, and to do it in this country. I had to turn series down a couple of times, and it was a bad thing to do because the networks really got ticked at you. But you couldn't do a good job when it overwhelmed the people. A lot of the clients didn't care about what happened to the people. Well, I had lived through a couple of years, like 6, 7, 8, 9 of them, where you knew what happened to the people when there was no work and you didn't, and nobody cared. You know, one time we had 875 people working for us, plus some people on the outside. I have no idea how that was done.
The television landscape was changing by the 1980s, and one of the things Lou saw was the future of what television would be like, that there would be lots of channels out there.
He really did have a real vision of the future for cable and how it could really be a wonderful opportunity to just program for kids 24/7.
Syndication didn't need to be a graveyard of old shows. If you produced something new for the syndicated market, you could actually have a successful show because people would go, oh, there's something new I can watch every day.
We had just been acquired, about a year before that, by Group W, Westinghouse Broadcasting Company, and they had a domestic syndication arm. And I said, I'm going to make a deal with them to produce this stuff and sell it directly to the stations. It was a huge commitment. I mean, for us, it was almost a $20 million commitment.
Dad spent so much money in pre-production that Westinghouse just had to go do it whether they wanted to or not. And they had a huge hit in their hand, and all of a sudden they've opened up a whole new area of programming for kids and a whole new marketplace, and they were the kings.
Pretty much television animation was the property of the networks. They liked the show, they bought a show, they controlled the show, and it went on the air. And Lou, to my understanding, could frequently have a rocky relationship with some of the network people because Lou is a man of principle. And he wasn't willing to do just anything to get a show on the air.
Lou had a deal with the toy company whereby he had complete creative freedom over what He-Man and the Masters of the Universe would be. They couldn't tell him, you must use these toys. He made a choice whether they would use those toys or those characters or create new ones.
Other studios would have the character get in a Jeep to go to the tank, to get to the airplane, to go to the aircraft carrier, to get to the submarine, to land in the space shuttle. And everything had 10 seconds of time just to get the toys in there.
We made sure as much as we possibly could that it was not a half-hour commercial. It was glorious not to be able to deal with networks. And it wasn't for the individuals, it was the ability that they had to control what goes on the air and how people are treated and working. And they didn't care about it, whether an animator was working or not.
This is the first time in his history, in Filmation's history, that they didn't have to go through layoffs around Christmas time because they had finished producing all the material for the networks. When they started doing first-run animation for syndication, they got to work year-round. And that changed the life of people because they didn't have to worry that they're going out of work.
Normally, Saturday morning cartoons had 13 episodes per season or 26 episodes per season. Filmation, to make up Monday through Friday, 5 shows a week without significant reruns, they did 65 episodes. That's the equivalent of 5 years of a normal cartoon show, and they had to produce that for 1 season.
I was a nervous wreck, and it was on a boat off New York. My wife was there, the 2 kids were there, and I didn't have anything to drink, no wine, no nothing. And then my son came up, he said, Dad, you don't have to worry, you don't have to say anything. I said, well, why? He said, well, I just saw them give the Emmy to Captain Kangaroo. I said, oh God, thank God. I sat back and I had a couple of drinks. And then Cyril Richard came up there and he says, and for the best children's program, Lou Scheimer. I said, holy shit, that's me. I wandered into the aisle and God bless the little man, Frizz Freeling, came over and hugged me. And it kept me from falling down because I was plastered. I got up to in front of that microphone, and I have no idea what I said.
I don't know what to say, except a very, very special thanks to my very, very special friend and co-producer, Norm Prescott, and my lovely family, my wife, Jay, my son, and my daughter, Lena and Erica, and all those great, great people who produce for us in the art of animation, that Filmation, those wonderful shows. Thank you very, very much.
I got my father there with me and my kids, and we watched the show. And poor Lou come up, and he looked so nervous and shaky. You know? I kept waiting for him to say, and I want to thank Hal, you know. And he said Norm instead, you know.
I didn't say thank you, Hal, for having done what you did, because Hal, he directed every show on the Star Trek shows. He came down, he did more work than he'd ever done in his life with us, and he really deserved it more than I did, and I really didn't remember.
For years, up until this past year, we both harbored this mortal sin or venial sin, whatever. We felt guilty. I never said anything to him, and he never said anything to me, and finally we confessed to each other, and I mean, we love each other dearly.
I can blame it on a bottle now, but it was not, it made me feel bad for a long time.
But it was an exciting moment, and his son was there, and his son jumped up and threw his arms around his dad. I mean, it was a touching, touching moment.
Thank you, Hal. The Emmy was a peculiar Emmy. I really felt sad for the, it should have gone to Fat Albert. And in my innermost, I felt that maybe it had to do with the fact that the kids were black, that they weren't voted for. And that was a terrible feeling. And Cosby said to me one day, he said, "Why do you keep entering the show to try to get an Emmy?" I said, "Because it deserves one." He said, "They're never going to get one, Lou." I said, I can't believe that. And you know, it may be true, and that's really sad if it is true.
Little by little, he was sending some things overseas that you just couldn't afford anymore. If he had only paid the workers their union benefits and no salary whatsoever, it was still much less expensive to do it overseas. Looking back, you could see it coming. We just weren't aware. We kept thinking it would be pulled out.
It was getting very difficult for even Westinghouse to okay stuff that is going to cost $20 or $30 million. So I introduced the Westinghouse people to these nice people from Europe.
It was a long, hard set of negotiations, and after 9 months, a year, my dad went out to have a big celebration dinner of the signing of the contracts that day. When he came home that night, my dad informed me that he learned in the course of that evening that this was not a celebration for continued production, that indeed that the company that just bought Filmation was going to close Filmation down.
Well, they turned out to be idiots. I mean, multi-millionaire idiots. They wanted to buy the studio, but they really didn't want to keep the people working. They wanted all those hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of half hours, and they thought they could sell that stuff over and over and over again. They were not evil people. They knew nothing about the people. They didn't know anything about the studio. They didn't know anything about how animation really worked in this country, and they had no idea of how vital it was to keep an important group of people working together.
And it's the only time that he and I ever had a drink in the office. He said, I never do this. I never drink at work. And we just had a couple of big drinks to go over this.
They gave me 3 days' notice to close the studio and lay off hundreds of people. Well, it was the most devastating day of my life.
All of the employees of Filmation were gathered into one large room, and we were told that Filmation was no longer in the animation business.
It was really an unbelievable time. I never saw such shock in my life as the day when we all thought we were working, and all of a sudden it was everybody get out in the next hour or two. It was that quick.
They were in the middle of production on several series. So they'd been recorded, some episodes had been animated and so forth, when they actually had to shut their doors.
None of us had a clue that was coming. We came into work that morning to do our work.
We were told to put down our pencils, everybody get out.
He hired people on Monday of that week at Filmation, and Friday he had to fire people.
He had been lied to, and they'd essentially taken everything away from him that he had built for 20 years.
He was emotional at the meeting, but he also knew he had to be strong for everyone. So it was really hard for most of us to tell how it affected Lou that the studio had closed down, because I don't think he wanted us to see.
I couldn't really face them very honestly because I had not lived up to I had not done what I was supposed to do, which was to keep them working. And they stood up and clapped.
People stood up and they cheered him. And they knew that he did everything he could to keep this company alive. And they cheered him and they wept. I was in that audience and I was crying like I'm crying now because everybody was shocked and everybody just loved him so much, and they knew that this wasn't his doing.
The end of Filmation really came about due to the success of Filmation. The effect that Filmation had with the syndicated animation market led to Disney doing animated shows Monday through Friday, Warner doing animated shows Monday through Friday. All these studios sent their work overseas to save costs and to produce their animation cheaper.
The worst thing that's happened since Filmation doesn't exist anymore is there isn't any real effective entry level for young people coming into the business now.
We're losing something, and there's no reason for it. It didn't have to happen.
Everybody who now is working in animation, whether it's at Disney or Pixar or Warner Brothers or someplace else, came through Filmation early on when they were learning.
He loved finding the next generation, and it gives him a lot of joy to see that his youngins have gone off and become amazingly successful people.
They are one of, if not the most influential animation studio in television history.
In my opinion, Lou Scheimer is one of the three most important people in animation in the last quarter of the last century. The other two would be Ralph Bakshi and Steven Spielberg. These are three people that without whom I believe animation would have died out as we knew it.
It's just, there was nothing better than working with those people.
I think Lou will be looked upon as a guy who was a real champion of domestic produced cartoons. He believed that animation could convey positive messages and little life lessons. I think when people come up to him and say, you know, I learned from you and your cartoons, I think that makes him feel very, very happy.
Lou's one of the guys that helped create American animation, pioneered the television animation, and helped it build it into what it is now. And there's a genuine direct link between me and Lou Scheimer and the guys that came before him. And everybody went back to the very first guy, be it Winsor McKay, that first started doing animation.
His personality to anybody who worked with Lou is the most noble and wonderful of his legacies.
I'd say we were close to brothers. We've shared tears and joy, everything.
I always think that my dad is the real Walt Disney. Everybody has an idea of who Walt Disney was, what a great guy he was, this guy of the people and the artists. My dad really was that guy. He's really the heart of animation.